He spent years living in solitude, keeping his distance from any woman, never letting a single one so much as brush against him, until a request from a young stranger forced him back to the place where fire had tried to wipe his history from the earth. Can you imagine the weight of carrying so much guilt and fear that the simple touch of a hand becomes unbearable? And yet, to be pushed by fate back into the very house where everything you loved was consumed by flames, right in front of eyes that pretended to see nothing. Well, this story actually happened in the dry winter of 1903, on the dusty trails of St. Bennett's Valley, a forgotten corner of the desolate hinterlands. Before we ride any further down this trail, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and smash the like down below, because what this man discovered in that abandoned manor didn't just change his destiny, it altered the fate of an entire community. What he found in that place, everyone feared, proved that no matter how deep folks try to bury the truth under ash and silence, it always finds a way back to the light. And tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. It's always moving to see how far these stories from our heartland can travel. On that freezing afternoon in July 1903, the wind cut across the low hills, kicking up thin clouds of red dust that clung to the face of anyone brave enough to walk the dirt road. The sun was already dipping behind the ridges, spilling a sickly yellow light over the barbed wire fences, the lonely mesquite bushes, and the few cattle chewing cud in a sparse pasture. In the middle of this parched landscape, a man walked slowly, clutching a bundle of coarse cloth against his chest, revealing the worn edges of an old harness. His steps marked the earth as if each one weighed more than it should, and his felt hat, darkened by time, hid part of his face, but not enough to disguise the exhaustion in his eyes. His name was Jeremiah Barnes, a 54-year-old saddler who lived almost as if he were part of the landscape of St. Bennett's Valley. Anyone passing by the road who saw the small wattle and daub shack with crooked shingles, set a bit apart from the general store and the church, knew that was the leather workshop where he spent his entire days. The place smelled of a blend of grease, tanned hide and wood smoke, with tools hanging from bent nails on the wall, stacks of saddle parts in a corner, and strips of leather dangling from a makeshift line. It was there that Jeremiah repaired saddles, harnesses, belts, and sheepskins, working in silence, listening only to the rhythmic sound of his awl piercing the leather and the creaking of his old workbenches. Those who saw Jeremiah for the first time couldn't imagine that this man had once been someone else. Years prior, folks said he laughed easily, played the fiddle on festive nights, and was the first to pull people onto the dance floor at the county fairs. He had an open way about him, talked to everyone, and most importantly, never took his eyes off his wife, Helen, a woman with a wide smile who worked as a seamstress at the old scorched orchard estate. Back then, Jeremiah spent more days at the ranch than in his own shop, fixing tack, helping with chores, and seizing every break to be near her, to listen to the stories she brought from the grand varnished wood parlors, the hushed conversations in the wide hallways, and the dresses she sewed for the colonel's daughters. All of that was left behind one night the local folks never forgot. The memory that haunted Jeremiah always began with the same smell, the thick scent of smoke mixed with roasting corn, because he and Helen were in the ranch's back kitchen preparing grits for a small harvest festival celebration. The wall clock read nearly 10, and the cold wind blew through the window, making the lantern flame dance. Suddenly, a distinct crack cut through the air, a dry snap coming from the direction of the supply barn. Moments later, a crimson glare invaded the night, and screams began to echo through the corridors, mixed with the desperate lowing of cattle. Jeremiah ran outside, heart pounding, and saw flames licking the barn roof as if they had been born from inside the dry timber. The fire climbed fast, spitting sparks that the wind scattered to other corners of the ranch. Men ran back and forth carrying buckets, throwing water that seemed to vanish before touching the fire, while the sound of things bursting inside grew louder. Amidst the confusion, Helen's voice rose above the din, coming from the hallway connecting the kitchen to the back room, where she had gone to fetch a box of thread and fabric. It was a sharp scream, calling his name with a desperation that still made his blood run cold today. He tried to push through the smoke-filled hallway, feeling the heat searing the air and scratching his throat. His eyes began to water, the ceiling groaned, and pieces of burning wood fell near his feet. Just as he was about to reach the door of the room where Helen should have been, two massive hands grabbed his shoulders from behind, yanking him back with force. He turned, just enough to see the hard face of one of the colonel's foremen, eyes wide, mouth shouting that it was no use, that the roof was coming down. Jeremiah fought, kicked, tried to break free, felt another man grab his arms, and heard an order barked in the authoritative voice of the colonel himself, commanding them to get him out of there. In that instant, a flaming beam crashed from the ceiling, striking the side of his head. The world spun. The taste of blood rose in his mouth, and the last thing Jeremiah heard was the sound of his name being called by Helen, mingling with the snap of breaking wood and the roar of the fire. When he woke up the next day, he was lying on a makeshift mattress in Miss Pearl's general store, his head bandaged and a pain pulsing in his left temple. The smell of smoke still impregnated his clothes, and a heavy silence filled the room. The colonel appeared with a grim face, spoke few words, said it was a fatality, that the fire started in the barn and spread too fast, that no one could save Helen. From that day on, Jeremiah was never the same. The thin scar that remained on his left temple was just the visible trail of something much larger that burned inside. He carried, like a weight glued to his chest, the feeling that he should have done more, that if he hadn't obeyed the order, maybe he would have died with Helen, but he wouldn't have left her alone, calling for him. The following weeks were a blur of a simple burial, looks of pity, and whispers saying that fire on a big ranch was never just an accident, though no one dared speak too loudly. Gradually, Jeremiah stopped going to church, stopped playing the fiddle, stopped accepting invitations for anything. He went back to living alone in a little shack near the road and buried his body and mind inside the leather workshop. Inside there, time began to be measured by the quantity of saddles fixed and harnesses patched, no longer by the calendars nailed to the wall of the general store. He woke early, put water to heat on the wood stove, drank weak coffee with a piece of hardtack, and sat at the bench in the same beige cotton shirt and worn vest. His calloused hands slid over the leather as if searching for another texture, another warmth he no longer allowed himself to feel. When any woman entered the shop to order a belt, a bag, or a repair, he would stiffen completely. He avoided brushing against her fingers when measuring a waist, took a step back if he felt her body getting too close, spoke the bare minimum, and rushed to finish the job. There were those who tried to strike up a conversation, crack a joke, even a harmless flirtation, but the wall he had built around himself was so high that after a while hardly anyone insisted. In the village, folks started saying Jeremiah wouldn't touch a woman anymore, that he had turned into a sort of shadow. Some called him mad with grief, others a man of respect who held a true mourning. The fact is, no one saw him in the chatting circles at dusk anymore, nor approaching the music ring at festivals. When he had to go to Miss Pearl's store to get coffee, salt, or kerosene, he limited himself to a nod, paid in counted coins, and returned to his refuge of leather and silence. The only thing linking him to the past was the habit of every now and then running his hand over the scar on his temple, as if that gesture confirmed that everything had been real. It was on one of these late afternoons that fate decided to stir the ashes he tried so hard to keep settled. The sky was a deep orange hue, the road dust seemed even more vivid, and a cold wind made the dry branches of an ironwood tree knock against each other, producing a hollow sound. Jeremiah was sitting at the bench, stitching a torn sheepskin, when he heard the rhythmic trot of an animal approaching. It wasn't rare for someone to stop there to fix a strap mid-journey, so he didn't even lift his head immediately. The sound of hooves faded until it stopped right in front of the shop, followed by the creak of the wooden door being pushed open. When he finally looked, he saw a young woman standing in the doorway, struggling to hold an old, heavy saddle that seemed to have lived longer than anyone on that road. She had sun-weathered skin, a light scarf tied around her head holding back her hair, and her eyes flashed in a way that mixed fatigue, determination, and a thread of distrust. Her simple cotton dress, already worn at the hem, had dust splatters up to the knees, as if she had come from far away. The mule that brought her was still wheezing outside, tied to a post near the fence, its sweaty coat glistening in the twilight. Jeremiah felt, before any thought, that old reflex to pull away when he realized he would have to get close to her to take the saddle. He took a deep breath, wiped his hands on a rag hanging near the bench, and stood up slowly. The young woman took a step further inside, letting the smell of the road and sweat mix with the shop's scent of leather. Instead of handing over the saddle right away, she observed the room for a moment, as if registering every detail. She looked at the tools, the leather strips, the stove still warm in the corner, and finally let the weight of the saddle slip a little in her arms. She introduced herself as Claire Norton and said she came from a remote part of the region, a place few locals knew by name, near Deep Rock Creek. She explained she had inherited that saddle from an abandoned barn in an area where the scorched orchard estate once operated, now practically taken over by brush. Jeremiah, hearing the name of the ranch, felt a tightness in his chest so strong he had to lean his hand on the bench for a second. The air seemed to grow heavier inside the shop, as if the simple word had brought with it the smell of old smoke he tried so hard to forget. Claire continued, without immediately noticing his reaction. She said the saddle had been found wrapped in dirty cloth, hidden behind torn sacks and tool scraps, and something about the piece caught her attention. Handling the leather lining, she noticed some stitching was recent, clashing with the rest. Coming from a family used to keeping secrets in small hiding places, she suspected there might be something more inside than straw stuffing. Carefully, she cut a few stitches and found, hidden between two layers of leather, a piece of old paper, folded, marked by smoke and dampness. It was at this point in the story that she raised her eyes, fixing her gaze on Jeremiah with an intensity that unsettled him. She recounted that upon unfolding the paper, she read two names written by hand, in neat script that looked like a clerk's, Helen Barnes and Jeremiah Barnes. She said firmly that she didn't know who this Helen was, but when she heard folks at the general store mention a widower saddler named Jeremiah Barnes, she understood she couldn't ignore it. The paper also contained some confusing notes of measurements, numbers, and references to stone markers and creeks, which made no sense to her but seemed serious. Jeremiah felt his legs go weak for an instant. The sound of Helen's name, echoing from the mouth of a stranger so many years later, was as if someone had forcibly pried open a door he kept locked inside himself. The memory of her face, the dress she wore on the night of the fire, the way she called his name, exploded in his mind with painful clarity. He took a deep breath, pressed his fingers against the wood of the bench, and tried to keep his voice steady as he asked again where that saddle came from and how exactly she had found the paper. Claire explained calmly that her family had been expelled from a piece of land after a boundary dispute with men working for the colonel, who now ran nearly the whole region. She said she grew up hearing her father speak of a great wrong committed years ago, of a fire that changed the history of many people, and of a surveyor who had disappeared taking important secrets with him. After her father died in a confusing ambush, she started digging into anything that could explain why they seemed to live as intruders on land they had always worked. Her father spoke of a certain burnt manor, of a black lemon tree that insisted on bearing fruit even after the fire, and of names that should never be forgotten. That was why, when she found the paper with Jeremiah's and Helen's names inside that saddle, she understood it wasn't a coincidence. She came there with a goal that went far beyond fixing leather. Her request wasn't just for him to reinforce the stitching and fix the saddle for use. What she wanted, truly, was for him to agree to go with her to the old scorched orchard manor, where, according to rumors, there were still locked trunks, burnt shelves and corners no one had the courage to disturb. She believed that in that place everyone said was cursed, there were still hidden things that could explain why so many people were driven out, why so many lives were broken. Jeremiah recoiled immediately, as if he'd been struck. The simple idea of setting foot in that manor again made his heart race in a way that ached in his chest. The images of the fire night returned in rapid sequence, the roof collapsing, Helen's voice getting lost in the screams, the strength of the arms dragging him out, the door closing before he could return. He stammered no, that there was no reason to stir up something so old, that the past was best left quiet. He tried to cling to the excuse that he had too much work, that the road was too long for a man of his age, that the house now only held rats, mold, and misery. But Claire didn't let herself be intimidated by the first refusal. She brought the saddle closer to the bench, careful not to invade his space too much, and repeated that she needed the help of someone who had a connection to what was written on that paper. She said it made no sense for his name to be hidden there if there wasn't something important behind it. She added that, alone, she might even manage to go to the manor and poke around some corners, but she wouldn't know how to recognize what was valuable, what could be proof of anything, and above all, she wouldn't know how to deal with the living memory of that place, because for her it was just a story told, but for him it was an open wound. Later, when Jeremiah went out to fetch water from a clay pot behind the shop, the news of a strange girl's presence in his place was already running through Miss Pearl's store. Folks who had gone to buy tobacco or kerosene commented in low voices that a strange wind was blowing in St. Benet's Valley, bringing the past back. That was how the legend of the scorched orchard began to take shape again in the people's mouths. Sitting on wooden benches, clasping cups of strong coffee, the elders began to recall the way the flames had taken over the ranch, the whispered conversations afterwards about papers burned in haste, a surveyor who vanished without a trace, women's screams echoing in the night even days after everything was out, Miss Pearl, with her apron always stained with flour and quick hands wiping the counter, recounted that no one wanted to live in the manor after that night. She said that in certain early mornings, if someone dared pass by the upper road, they could swear they saw, through the dark window, a shadow crossing the master bedroom, as if searching for something lost and never found. She swore she had heard, mixed with the sound of the wind, a long call, asking for help from a certain Jeremiah. Some customers crossed themselves, others laughed nervously, but no one had the courage to go there to check up close. While the legend was retold at the store, Jeremiah remained inside the workshop, torn between the impulse to send Claire away and the uncomfortable feeling that ignoring that paper would be betraying not only Helen's memory, but also all the people whose stories crossed with his in that dry land. The young woman sensed the conflict stamped on his face and changed her approach slightly. Instead of insisting only on the trip to the manor, she began asking simpler questions, wanted to know what Helen was like, how they met, what he remembered of life before the fire. Carefully she gave space for him to speak if he wanted, without forcing it. Gradually, in a flow that surprised Jeremiah himself, a few words began to escape. He spoke, in short sentences, of how Helen laughed at anything, how she liked to hang colourful clothes on the ranch clothesline, how she was afraid of thunder and curled up next to him on nights of heavy rain. He spoke of a pale blue dress she sewed for one of the colonel's daughters, knowing she would never have one like it for herself. As he spoke, he realized it had been years since he pronounced her name out loud. Each syllable seemed to scrape inside, but at the same time opened a space that had been clogged with silence. By nightfall, Claire realized she had already gone further than she usually did with any strange man. Trust didn't come from immediate likeness, but from the recognition of a pain similar to hers, even if in different stories. She gathered the saddle, agreed to return the next day, and made it clear she wouldn't give up easily on her request. Before leaving, still in the shop doorway, she looked one last time at Jeremiah and said that if he didn't go with her to the manor, she would go alone. She added only that if something in there had been left with him in mind, perhaps it was too cruel to leave it buried forever. That night, Jeremiah tried to sleep, but sleep came in pieces. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ranch hallway filled with smoke, saw Helen calling, saw the hands that held him back. Amidst the images, now visions of the old saddle, the paper with his name, and Claire's insistent eyes began to appear too. The wind hitting the shack's shingles produced a sound like distant moans, and the creaking wood resembled slow steps crossing an old floor. He got up more than once, lit the lantern, ran his hand over the scar on his temple, and paced in circles around the small room, as if looking for an answer written on the mud walls. On the other side of the village, Claire wasn't sleeping either. In the makeshift annex of the scorched orchard house, where she had already started spending some nights with her sick uncle, she listened to the wind whistling through the cracks of the burnt walls and thought about the risk she was running by, stirring up stories so many people wanted left buried. She remembered the image of her father saying at his bedside that one day someone would have the courage to show what really happened on that land. She remembered seeing her mother cry in silence while folding a few clothes to leave in a hurry the farm they lost, without the right to question anyone. And now, for the first time, she felt that perhaps she wasn't completely alone in this search. When the next day began to brighten, bringing an even sharper cold and a low mist hovering over the pasture, Jeremiah was already up, his face marked by deep, dark circles. He splashed water on his face from a cold basin, ran his hands through his graying hair trying to tame it slightly, and stood for some time in front of the workshop door, looking at the road. The silence of that hour seemed to ask a question he had been trying to avoid for years. How long was he going to let fear and guilt rule every step he took? In the distance, the rhythmic sound of hooves approached along the road again. Claire's figure appeared once more, mounted now with a simple wool coat over her dress, protecting herself from the cold. Behind her, further off, the silhouette of the scorched orchard manor was vaguely drawn on the horizon, like a dark stain against the clear sky. Jeremiah felt his heart accelerate and, at the same time, a strange calm run through his body, as if the decision he had been pushing away finally had to be made. It was as if the dry earth of St. Bennett's Valley itself, with all the stories buried in it, was awaiting the choice of that man who, for so long, refused to touch and be touched. When Claire stopped the mule in front of the shop and dismounted, holding the old saddle again, she didn't need to repeat the whole speech from the day before. Jeremiah's look, tired but a bit steadier, met hers for a few seconds longer than usual. He took a deep breath, adjusted the hat on his head, wiped his hands on a rag as if preparing for a difficult job, and, instead of backing away, took a step toward the road. His voice came out hoarse, but clear enough to define the path ahead, when he said that if there was something in the manor that still bore his name and Helen's, then it was time to see with his own eyes what fire and silence hadn't managed to destroy. A few weeks passed since the day Jeremiah finally decided to walk alongside Claire toward the road leading to what remained of the old scorched orchard estate, and in that interval life in St. Bennett's Valley seemed to settle into a new routine, but full of things no one there would dare call peaceful. Early in the morning, when the mist still clung low to the pasture and the cold made the oxen's breath rise in small clouds, Jeremiah alternated his presence between the workshop and the burnt manor, as if dividing his heart between the place where he learned to hide and the place where he was forced to face everything he always wanted to forget. At first, he found practical excuses to go there, telling himself he needed to deliver leather repairs, check if the old saddle held up, adjust a strap on Claire's mule. But as the days went by, he could no longer pretend that was the only thing pulling him down that path. The routine at the scorched house, even laden with shadows, began to take on the outlines of a home for the living. In the less burnt annex, Claire arranged a corner for Uncle Silas, raising his mattress on bricks to escape the dampness of the floor a bit, hanging a makeshift curtain made of washed sackcloth, placing an old stove near the door so she could cook without filling the room with smoke. Little Anna Rosa scattered pebbles and leaves around the yard, inventing games that disguised her fear of the noises the house made at night, while Elias, always glued to her, feigned bravery with his chin up, but let his hands tremble when a louder creak came from the floorboards above. Jeremiah initially kept to the front part, near the porch, observing everything with a mix of suspicion and care, but little by little his body got used to walking through corridors that had once been the stage of nightmares. In the silence of the workshop, when he returned to the village, his thoughts no longer stuck only to the shape of the stitches and the shine of grease on leather. Even with his head down, fingers steady on the work, his mind insisted on returning to the crooked design of the soot-stained walls, to the muffled sound of Claire's footsteps walking on the floor of the master bedroom, to Silas's tired breathing echoing behind a half-open door. At night, when he lay on his plank bed in the shack near the road, images of the last few days shuffled together. He saw the young woman bent over the table with the lantern lit, deciphering faded letters, saw the children whispering about voices they thought they heard from the ceiling, saw his own distorted reflection in a broken pane of the manor, as if he were a stranger spying on a ghost. It was on one of those nights when the wind seemed to blow thinner through the cracks of the scorched house that the first full revelation came of what until then had been mere suspicion. Claire called Jeremiah to sit at the rough table they had dragged to the center of the least destroyed room. Spread over the scorch-stained wood were the pages of the thick notebook found in the hiding place under the floorboards, the ledger that seemed to contain more than simple farm accounts. The leather cover, darkened by soot and time, bore finger marks, as if someone had tried to rip it in haste from somewhere amidst the smoke. The internal leaves, though yellowed, still held clearly the neat strokes of a surveyor who took seriously the job of measuring and drawing the world around him. The first pages carried sketches of rivers, contour lines, markings of large rocks, and century-old trees used as references, with numbers and notes of fathoms, leagues, and spans. Jeremiah, who was never much for reading, could only follow with difficulty, but Claire read in a low voice, running her finger along each line, piecing together the information like someone assembling a fabric someone had torn. Over time, family names began to appear, small lists indicating who had a right to which slice of land, scribbled in the margins of the drawings: Norton, Barnes, Santana, Miller. Besides some surnames, the surveyor had noted dry observations, as if wanting to remind himself of conversations and agreements. Verbal agreement, promise before the priest, deed to be registered. The further they advanced, the clearer the original intention of that ledger became. It wasn't just a cold record of possessions, but also a testimony to a moment when, after the abolition of slavery and amidst political changes, no one there understood quite right. Some simple families had, for a brief instant, the chance to become owners of the land they cultivated. Helen, years before, had heard of these agreements in the ranch corridors, but never had anything in her hands. Now, in the ledger, her name appeared written in the same ink that marked the boundaries, directly linked to a plot of land stretching from a narrow creek to a group of deep rocks that gave the name to the region where Claire's family had lived. Beside it, Jeremiah's name appeared as heir by marriage, in a note that seemed to have been made in haste, perhaps shortly before the fire. In a certain passage, the surveyor described that half of the scorched orchard lands should be fragmented among 4 families who worked there as long-time tenants, while the other half would remain registered to the patriarch of the Miller family in an attempt to reconcile old power with minimal justice. There lay, drawn with an almost stubborn precision, a map of a life that never happened. A few pages later, the narrative of the notebook changed tone. The lines became a bit shakier, the notes quicker, as if the man knew the time he had to record everything was running out. Phrases appeared like pressure from the colonel to delay registration, suspicion of planned fire, keep copy in safe place. That was how they discovered that the hiding place under the floorboards wasn't a last-minute improvisation, but part of an emergency plan. The surveyor, it seemed, had decided to make a copy of what he considered essential and keep it inside the colonel's own house, in a place where no one would suspect something threatening the master of the house lay. The plan, however, was interrupted by the fire. What no one had foreseen was that years later, precisely a young woman connected to the family of expelled squatters would find part of that story stitched inside a saddle, as if the leather had become the guardian of a truth the world tried to burn. With every new page read, Jeremiah felt the ground shift a little beneath his feet. What he had believed for so long to be a blind punishment, a tragedy thrown by chance upon his life, began to take on the contours of a human, calculated decision. The idea that someone could have caused a fire not only to get rid of evidence, but without caring about the lives inside, made an ancient, stifled type of anger want to wake up within him. At the same time, guilt was reshaped. It wasn't just for failing to get Helen out alive, but also for not questioning, for so many years, the version they shoved down his throat. Claire, on the other hand, read those lines and saw in the elegant letters confirmation of what her father had whispered so many times at the foot of the bed, that the lands where they planted were not stolen, that there was a paper somewhere proving it, that one day someone would find it. The silver plates that had come with the notebook, small and heavy, with rudimentary crests engraved by hammer, made sense now. Each represented a family that would have a right to a part of that land. One of them bore in tiny engravings initials matching Helen's surname and, therefore, Jeremiah's. Another carried a crude drawing resembling a tree with exposed roots, which Claire associated with the shape of the deep rocks surrounding the creek near where she grew up. The third, finally, showed something that looked like a broken chain, a symbol that might have been chosen by some freed slave who dreamed for an instant of owning the ground he walked on. But knowing the truth was just the first layer of the problem. From there, a dilemma opened up that wouldn't be solved with a simple trip to the notary. Claire's family barely had anything to eat. Uncle Silas coughed with a deep wheeze in his chest, which got worse in the cold early mornings, and the children alternated days of reasonably full bellies when some sale brought food, with days when the plate held only thin broth with flour. Jeremiah, in turn, had a workshop with fewer and fewer customers because the crisis was squeezing everyone and there wasn't a drover who didn't try to delay a repair payment or pay less than owed. The fear of not being able to buy even the month's salt seemed more concrete than any promise of distant land. It was in this context that appeared, in the last pages of the notebook, an indication that lit another kind of flame. Amidst measurement notes, the surveyor had scribbled a small cross symbol next to a short phrase, almost hidden among numbers. Reserve in coin, see curved rock mark, right bank of dry creek. Along with this, There was a quick calculation indicating a sum of silver coins he intended to leave hidden, perhaps as security for his own family, perhaps as a way to ensure that if everything went wrong with official records, someone would still have the means to start over. The discovery that besides the moral and legal value of the papers, there might be hard cash there, buried at some point on the terrain, brought to the table a temptation difficult to despise. Claire was the first to say out loud what both were thinking in silence. She commented that if they managed to find that small treasure, they could at least buy decent medicine for Silas, guarantee food for a few months, and perhaps pay for the trip to the larger city, where a judge who didn't walk arm in arm with the colonel might hear their story. Jeremiah, torn between prudence and necessity, knew that disturbing something guarded by another man, even dead and forgotten, was a delicate step. However, the gaunt faces of the children, Claire's hollow eyes, the uncle's wheezing chest, and his own overdue bills weighed much more than any abstract code of honor that no one around respected when it came to land. The moral dilemma gained even stronger contours when two debt collectors appeared at the scorched house, sent by the colonel's men, with a crumpled paper in hand and unfriendly faces. They said Silas had an old lease debt for occupying a piece of land on the edge of the colonel's fences, and that patience had run out. If payment wasn't made in a few days, they would take Claire's mule, the few pieces of furniture they had, and confiscate part of future harvests. The voice of one of them sounded almost indifferent when he said that if they wanted to avoid trouble with hired guns, they'd better find a way fast. Jeremiah, hearing that, felt the old bitter taste of humiliation rise in his throat. The same he had felt years ago when he swallowed the ready-made version of the fire with no one to appeal to. After the collectors left, kicking up dust on the road, the silence that remained inside the manor was heavier than any ghost noise. The children huddled in a corner. Silas coughed until he almost had no air, and Claire clenched her fists in a way that nearly made her nails mark her palms. It was there, between the concrete fear of misery and the abstract weight of years of injustice, that she and Jeremiah looked at each other like people recognizing there is no more room for middle ground. They decided, without pretty promises, that they would go after the rock mark described in the notebook. If they found what the surveyor had hidden, they would use part of it to settle the accounts suffocating them and guarantee immediate survival. The rest, they promised each other, would be used to carry forward the fight for what was rightfully theirs. The search for the strongbox began on a morning when the sky seemed lower and the wind came loaded with fine dust, kicked up by the few ox carts passing far from there. Following the notebook's indications, they walked along the right bank of a creek that, at that time of year, had almost no water, leaving only a few muddy puddles here and there. The large rocks that once gave the region its name rose like teeth of an ancient animal, sprouting from the dry ground. The rock mark described in the notebook was a specific curve, a block that, seen from a certain angle, looked like a lying ox. It took them a while to find the exact spot, circling the stones, comparing sketches with what the eyes saw, until Jeremiah recognized the rounded outline of the rock and pointed with a firm gesture. Armed with an old hoe, a shovel borrowed from a distant neighbor, and more courage than certainty, they began to dig beside the indicated stone, where the drawing marked a timid X. The earth was hard, compacted by years of sun and dust, and every spadeful torn away seemed to steal breath from the one holding the tool handle. Little by little, the hole opened up, revealing layers of darker soil, loose pebbles, dry roots. The sun rose. Sweat ran down both their faces. Jeremiah's shirt stuck to his back, Claire's scarf soaked on her forehead. The children, at a distance, watched with wide eyes, torn between the fascination of a treasure hunt and the fear that some kind of curse might break loose from down there. When Jeremiah's shovel hit something that didn't sound like stone, everyone's heart nearby skipped a beat. The sound was hollow, wood touched by metal. He knelt at the edge of the hole, cleared dirt with his hands, and saw the corner of a darkened wooden box emerge. The wood, though worn, still held its shape. Carefully, they pulled the box to the surface. The iron latch was rusted but gave way with a thin snap when Claire forced it with the tip of the hoe. For a moment, no one breathed. When the lid finally opened, the smell that escaped wasn't of rot, but of something kept too long, a mix of mold, dust, and a faint metallic trace. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, rested several silver coins already darkened by time, and a simple ring with a thick band that might have belonged to someone important to the surveyor. It wasn't a treasure capable of changing the world, but for those counting grains of rice, it looked like a fortune. The coins clinked with a sound that hadn't echoed in those people's lives for years. Claire, with trembling fingers, held one up to the light and saw on the surface the worn face of an old ruler. Jeremiah, for his part, didn't see just money. He saw there the gesture of a man who, knowing he might not be able to fulfill the promise of justice made in life, had tried to leave at least a tool for whoever came after. Back at the manor, the first practical consequence of that discovery was immediate. The coins were counted, separated, and a portion was exchanged for medicine in the nearest big town, on a quick trip Jeremiah made with a borrowed ox cart. Another part paid off the threat of the collectors, who upon receiving the money thought it best to pull back their heavy hand a little and return to the colonel with the news that, somehow, those folks had managed to scrape by. The last handful, smaller, was kept in a makeshift hiding place in the scorched house itself, no longer under the floorboards, but in a new hole Jeremiah opened behind a loose stone in the wall, protected by an old brick. However, in a region where every step of every person seemed to be watched by eyes used to sniffing out opportunity, it didn't take long for rumors to arise. One of the collectors, irritated at not having managed to squeeze out more than expected, let slip at the store that it was strange how a widowed saddler and a girl from nowhere had managed overnight to pay a significant debt. He commented with poison that they had been digging too much near the creek and messing with stone holes everyone always thought best left alone. His words flowed through the mouths of the curious like hot coffee, burning the tongues of those who listened a little, but leaving a taste no one wanted to let go of. Tyrell, one of the colonel's trusted henchmen, heard the story leaning in a corner of the store, pretending to look distractedly at some sacks of beans. He was a thin man, with a gaunt face and beady eyes that seemed never to blink enough. Used to turning gossip into ammunition, he stored the information that Jeremiah and Claire had been turning over the ground near the deep rocks. He mentally noted the detail that a wooden box had been taken from there, and that shortly after, debts were paid. He left the store without hurry, but with the certainty that this needed to be brought to the boss's attention. While the poison of gossip spread, life at the scorched house showed signs of improvement in small yet significant ways. Silas, with better medicine and slightly more plentiful food, began to cough less, although his breathing still came ragged. Anna Rosa got a used dress but whole, which Claire managed to buy for a few coins in town, and Elias went back to playing with sticks, pretending they were oxen and horses. Without hunger gripping his stomach so hard as to cut off his imagination, Jeremiah, seeing these changes, felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief at realizing the decision to dig had saved, at least for now, those people from an even deeper fall. Apprehension at knowing that in the land of powerful men, nothing went unnoticed for long. Confirmation of the colonel's gaze upon them came faster than expected. One afternoon, while Jeremiah was in the workshop adjusting a cinch, a breathless boy appeared bearing a message. He said Colonel Horace Miller wanted to speak with him on the porch of Hopewell Ranch, and that he'd better not delay. The boy's voice carried an edge of fear known to everyone there, the fear of displeasing the one who held not only the best lands, but also the keys to the church doors, the store, the school, everything. Jeremiah, hearing the message, felt his stomach churn. It had been a long time since he set foot on what had once been the stage of the happiest scenes and the greatest tragedy of his life. The path to Hopewell Ranch was flanked by well-kept fences, fat cattle, and a silence that screamed the contrast between the abundance of that patch and the dryness of the rest. Approaching, Jeremiah saw the big house rise with its white-painted facade, dark wood windows, and a wide porch with aligned rocking chairs. The colonel waited for him sitting, wearing a dark suit despite the heat, with a well-trimmed moustache and a white handkerchief carefully folded in his pocket. Beside the chair, a cup of coffee rested on a small table, exhaling a strong smell, mixing fresh roast and the sweet aroma of melted molasses. When Jeremiah climbed the porch steps, the colonel received him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke in a gentlemanly tone, offering a chair, asking about his health, as if they were old friends reuniting with good memories. Gradually, however, the subject slid, as expected, to what really interested him. He commented he'd heard Jeremiah was getting involved again with the old scorched orchard house, that disgrace everyone had agreed to forget. He said he understood the longing, that everyone grieves in their own way, but that it wasn't prudent to disturb things God had already burned once. Then, in an apparently casual tone, he asked how a man of simple trade had managed all of a sudden to handle a large debt linked to a sick squatter. He gave a dry laugh, saying that if a money tree had sprouted in front of the workshop, surely someone from the village would have run to tell. He suggested, with words full of sugar mixed with poison, that perhaps Jeremiah was being poorly advised, that a certain girl from afar might be filling his head with wrong ideas, of fighting against folks who only wanted the good of the region. In the middle of this conversation, without raising his voice too much, the colonel offered a deal that looked more like a trap. He said that if Jeremiah was in difficulty, he could offer a small piece of land, far from there, in a less disputed region, provided he stepped away from the scorched house and stopped mixing with stories of old papers and ancient measurements. He also promised to ease the burden on Silas's back, as long as everyone agreed not to touch the subject of boundaries and possession anymore. It was as if he extended a hand that on the outside seemed to help, but on the inside carried the branding iron, ready to burn anyone who dared say no. Jeremiah, sitting on the edge of the chair, felt every word as if it were a new weight placed on shoulders already tired. On one side, there was the very real fear of provoking the wrath of someone who could, with a gesture, close doors forever. On the other, the memory of the lines in the notebook, the names written in black ink, the promises made to Claire's father and to Helen's memory, even if in silence, held him on the edge of the decision. When he left there, after replying only that he would think about what he had heard, he walked back to the road without remembering the landscape between one house and the other, as if his mind kept spinning in circles inside his chest. Back at the scorched orchard, seeing Anna Rosa playing in the yard with a cornhusk doll, Elias trying to mount a makeshift stick horse, and Claire adjusting a sheet on the clothesline, Jeremiah understood a little better the size of the choice he held in his hands. It wasn't just about accepting or refusing any piece of land. It was deciding whether he would, once again, swallow a convenient version of history, or if he would dare put his own neck on the line in the name of something that seemed bigger than his life. He recounted, without hiding details, everything he had heard on the colonel's porch. Claire listened with a serious face, lips pressed tight, a glint of controlled anger in her eyes. It was on that same night that fate decided to bring onto the stage a piece that would make a difference in the silent war taking shape. While they arranged some papers on the table to prevent dampness from creeping up the notebook pages, they heard a knock at the back door of the manor. The sound was firm, but not aggressive, as if whoever was there knew that place didn't like to be surprised. When Jeremiah opened it, he faced a visage he hadn't seen in many years. A middle-aged man, thin, hands stained with ink, holding a crumpled hat against his chest. It was Ben Carter, the former clerk of the region's registry office, who had vanished off the map after a bad falling out with the old notary. Ben entered slowly, looking around like someone visiting an old, sick acquaintance. He said he heard from a drover's mouth that the widower with the scar and the girl of the lost lands were stirring up the past, and that the scorched house from where he himself had once fled, scared, had become a topic again. He said he had carried a weight in his chest for a long time that wouldn't settle, linked precisely to the night of the fire and the papers that disappeared. He confessed that, at the time, he saw signatures being forged, names being erased from records and others written in their place, but he was afraid to speak because he depended on the job and knew what big folks were capable of. Hearing that they had found the surveyor's ledger and understood part of the fraud, Ben sat at the table and asked to see it up close. His eyes, used to deciphering tiny letters and crooked stamps, quickly scanned the lines, confirming immediately that the document had value far greater than anyone there imagined. He explained that if they managed to take a faithful copy of those pages to a judge in a larger city, perhaps in the county seat, or even further, there would be legal grounds to contest the colonel's possessions. It wouldn't be simple nor quick, and it would require courage to face retaliation, but it wasn't impossible. It was Ben who brought to the surface, with more clarity, the true size of the moral dilemma for everyone there. He said, spelling it out, that they could simply sell the information to some enemy of the colonel, guarantee immediate money, and disappear to another region, starting life over in a place where no one would know anything. This exit, however ugly it seemed, would guarantee safety for the children, medicine for Silas, relative peace for Jeremiah and Claire. The other option would be to clash head-on, use the notebook and the accounts to try to get justice not only for them, but for all the families who would have a right to the land. In that case, they would have to count on the village's courage, the goodwill of distant authorities, and their own resilience to endure a long and unequal fight. Ben's presence, with his calm speech and a look mixing shame for past mistakes and a desire to repair them, made the temptation of the easier path lose a bit of its shine. In the middle of the conversation, he told a detail that until then no one knew. Before the fire, Helen had quietly sought out the registry, carrying a folded paper in her dress pocket, and asked him to keep it safe. It was a simple note, confirming that her father agreed with the division proposed by the surveyor and signed below. Ben, pressured by the notary, had handed the paper to his superiors, who, in turn, burned it in the dead of night. Since then, he never had peace, and seeing Helen's name intact in the notebook was, for him, a kind of sign that there was still a chance to correct, at least in part, what had happened. Meanwhile, in the village, comments about Jeremiah's visits to the scorched house and the comings and goings to town began to acquire less neutral contours. Some said he had gone completely mad, chasing ghosts with a girl no one knew exactly where she came from. Others, more malicious, insinuated there was an improper involvement, that the widower, after years without looking at any woman, had finally let himself be seduced by someone younger. Sharp tongues missed no chance to mix real pain with malice, because in a small village, good news walks slow, but nastiness runs on a swift horse. Amidst this storm announcing itself, the bond between Jeremiah and Claire strengthened almost silently. It wasn't grand gestures marking this change, but details, the way he extended a hand to help her down a bank without pulling back at the last second, her care in arranging a blanket over his shoulders when she saw him dozing in a chair after an exhausted day, The confidence with which one began to finish sentences, the other didn't have the courage to complete. Touch, which for so long was an impassable border for Jeremiah, was coming back little by little in small doses. An arm held to prevent a fall, a shoulder touched lightly to get attention, a firm hand holding the other when descending a nearly rotten wooden staircase. It was on an afternoon of heavy sky, with dark clouds threatening rain that stubbornly refused to fall, that the threat stopped being just a rumor to become something almost palpable. Returning from a quick trip to the creek, where they had washed some clothes, they found the yard of the scorched orchard with strange marks. Chicken feather remains were scattered on the ground near the gate, and one of the few birds they had left had been beheaded and hung upside down on one of the dry branches of the burnt tree. Dried blood trickled down the trunk like a dark line, and the wind swayed the bird's light body in a way that gave the impression someone had placed it there with a clear intention of sending a message. Claire clenched her jaw, anger and fear vying for space in her eyes. Rosa began to cry softly, hiding her face in the hem of her aunt's dress, while Elias feigned bravery and said that was just the wickedness of cowards. Jeremiah, looking at the scene, recognized the language of those who preferred to act in the shadows. It was a way of saying they knew where they lived, that they could take not only chickens, but everything else they had left, if needed. The threat had taken shape without needing a spoken word. That night, with the lantern casting long shadows on the soot-marked walls, Ben suggested it was time to think about how to not only defend themselves, but anticipate. He said that, within a few days, St. Benet's Revival Week would begin, one of the few moments when almost the entire village gathered in the same space, listening to the same words, breathing the same air. He proposed they take advantage of this concentration of people to somehow plant the seeds of truth in the heart of the community. They couldn't simply arrive with papers in hand and accuse the colonel at the church door, because that would be like throwing dry wood on an already lit fire. But they could perhaps use the preacher's own mouth to start questioning the single story told until then. It was discussing these possibilities, measuring risks and weighing words, that someone had the idea of making copies of the most important parts of the notebook, so that, even if the original were taken or destroyed, the essence of what it said would survive. Ben volunteered for the task, saying he still had the steady hand needed to copy letters faithfully. He spent the night and part of the early morning sitting at the table with quill, ink and lantern, reproducing lines, signatures, measurements, like someone praying an ancient litany. Jeremiah and Claire took turns beside him, ensuring the lantern flame didn't falter, that no drop of wax fell on the pages, that no suspicious noise coming from outside surprised the work. Amidst all this, in a moment of respite from the narrative, the voice telling this story allows itself to look at whoever is listening and make a simple but important request. If you are following along this far and feel that somehow this story of simple folks fighting against imposed silence is moving you, take a moment to leave your like and share it with someone who needs to believe that the truth, however buried it may be, can still find a way to appear. Stories like this gain strength when more eyes and ears gather around them, and that's how we make sure that, even at a distance, the courage of some serves as fuel for the hearts of others. When it seemed that, despite the fear and tension, things were beginning to take the shape of a plan, the escalation of the threat decided to show it didn't intend to sit still, watching. A few days before the revival began, someone took the trouble to go to the scorched house at a time when no one was around. Jeremiah and Claire had gone to the village to settle small matters, the children had stayed with a distant neighbor, and Ben was at the store, talking discreetly with Miss Pearl about possible allies. Upon returning, the scene they found inside the manor made everyone's blood run cold. The master bedroom, the one where they had discovered the hiding place under the floor and where they used to spread the notebook pages, was ransacked. The old bed remaining there had been overturned. Floorboards were ripped up in places. Clothes were thrown on the floor and torn, as if whoever was looking for something had lost patience halfway through the job. The lantern they used there had been smashed, leaving a trail of oil running across the floor. The crucifix that hung over the headboard now lay on the ground, with the wood splintered, and right below it, as if placed there on purpose, was the surveyor's ledger, with charred edges, some pages partially burned at the borders, others missing. The initial shock gave way to a kind of silent despair. Claire picked up the notebook carefully, blowing away the ash still clinging to certain leaves. She saw that important excerpts, precisely those detailing some more recent boundaries under the colonel's dominion, had disappeared. Other parts, linked to more distant lands, remained there, half-burned at the edges, but legible in the centre. This made it clear it hadn't been an act of blind vandalism. Whoever entered knew exactly what to look for, knew which pages to tear, which to take, which to destroy halfway as a warning. It was a message as clear as the beheaded chicken in the yard, but now it wasn't just a blood threat. It was a direct attack on the heart of the proof they had. Ben, arriving and seeing the state of the room, ran his hand through his hair with force, as if wanting to rip out the feeling of carelessness that assaulted him. He had spent nights copying parts of the notebook, but he hadn't finished everything yet. Fortunately, the missing pages there coincided with some that were already reproduced in his notepad, kept in a separate hiding place, in a cloth bag he never let out of his sight. This brought a thread of relief, but didn't erase the fact that now, more than ever, they were certain they were at the center of a dangerous game, from which they could no longer exit simply by turning their backs. Still searching the room, Claire found, tucked under the bed, a piece of cloth that didn't belong to anyone there. A strip of shirt with the same shade of blue she had seen many times on the shoulders of Tyrell, the colonel's henchman. It was as if the man had left, by carelessness or mockery, a piece of himself behind, confirming what everyone already suspected. From that moment on, the shadow haunting the house gained an official face. It was no longer about fear of ghosts, but the very concrete fear of an armed man with orders from above. In the heated conversation that followed, with everyone sitting around the destroyed table, breathing deep to not let panic take over, a certainty imposed itself. They couldn't count only on hidden papers and whispered conversations anymore. If the colonel and his men were willing to break down doors and tear up what didn't belong to them, it was a sign that the only thing that would still weaken them would be light cast upon what they wanted so badly to keep in the shadows. It was at this moment, hands still dirty with ash, that Jeremiah said with a firmness that surprised even himself, that perhaps the only way out was to speak everything out loud in front of everyone, even without any paper in hand. Claire, looking at him, understood the magnitude of the turning point that sentence represented. That man, who a short while ago could barely pronounce his own wife's name without trembling, now spoke of facing the owner of the region in an arena where, until then, only the voice of the strongest had space. Ben, for his part, agreed that the word, when repeated by many mouths at the same time, had a power that neither fire, nor money, nor threat could completely erase. The decision they began to mature there, amidst the wreckage of the ransacked room, pointed to a path of no return. Use St. Benet's Revival Week, with the church full and ears attentive, as a stage for the beginning of a truth that, once spoken, could never be fully taken back. On that late afternoon, when the wind began to warm up again over the hills of St. Benet's Crossing, the little church bell gave 3 short tolls that seemed to warn not only about prayer time, but also about the weight of the days to come. The revival week was approaching, and with it the opportunity Jeremiah, Claire and Ben had decided to grasp, even knowing it could change their lives forever. Inside the scorched house, the walls still smelled of stirred ash after the invasion, but now they also carried another scent, subtler, new paper mixed with fresh ink, coming from the copies Ben had spent nights making by lantern light. It was as if, amidst the mold and soot, the smell of something newborn was sprouting. The days immediately prior to the revival were of silent preparation. On one side, Colonel Horace moved his men, spoke in hushed tones with Reverend Anselm, made a point of being seen offering small alms to poorer families, as if wanting to reinforce the image of the traditional benefactor. On the other, in the burnt manor, Jeremiah and Claire reviewed with Ben the main points of what they needed to say, should they get the chance, so the story would come out round, without obvious gaps to be called a lie. It wasn't easy to transform into simple words, something involving land measurements, unregistered contracts, promises from decades ago. But Ben, used to translating registry language for those who barely knew how to read, helped organize the ideas, explaining that the most important thing was to show it wasn't just one family's interest, but many. Silas, even with his chest still wheezing, insisted on hearing everything. Lying on the mattress raised from the floor, he closed his eyes to concentrate better, and occasionally interrupted with a detail only someone who lived so long in the shadow of the Millers could know. He remembered, for example, a night he heard the old patriarch and the surveyor arguing on the porch about the haste to register the lands, about fear of outsiders coming to boss them around. He recalled a day Helen appeared in the kitchen with red eyes after a talk with the colonel, saying they had ordered her to take care of papers that couldn't fall into wrong hands. These memories, loose like pieces of cloth, began to stitch together with the ledger lines, creating a fabric difficult to tear. As the revival approached, signs of tension in the air became more visible. Tyrell and other henchmen of the colonel began to circulate more frequently on the road leading to the scorched orchard, pretending they were hunting armadillo or checking if the fence was whole. Near the store, folks who previously greeted Jeremiah with a wave now averted their gaze, afraid to be seen beside him. In compensation, there were also those who approached in secret, like a nearly blind cowboy who one day pulled Ben into a corner of the store to say he remembered, yes, seeing men with kerosene cans running toward the barn on the night of the fire, and that he knew if he spoke that aloud he could pay dearly, but his conscience was already weighing too heavy. On the eve of the revival, the scorched house had a strangely calm night. The wind blew gentler through the cracks. The floor creaked less, as if even the old timbers understood there needed to be, for a few hours, a little peace for everyone's heart to prepare. Jeremiah barely slept, but this time it wasn't just because of painful memories. It was also the weight of responsibility he felt, growing inside his chest, mixed with a thread of courage he hadn't recognized in himself for a long time. He thought of Helen, of the scorched dress, of her voice calling for him, and for the first time in years, instead of sinking only into guilt, he asked softly, looking at the darkened ceiling, "What would you do if you were in my place now?" On the morning of the first night of the revival, the village woke up in a different buzz. Folks came from distant homesteads. Wagons passed carrying entire families. Women balanced pots and platters for the potluck after the service. St. Bennett's Chapel, whitewashed with its low tower and a simple cross on top, gained colourful cloth flags hanging in the yard, fluttering in the wind. The bell, slightly cracked, rang more than once throughout the day, calling not only for prayers, but for the general gathering, for the exchange of news, for the mutual surveillance that always came with such events. When the sun began to hide behind the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jeremiah put on the best clothes he had, still simple but less threadbare. He tied a clean kerchief around his neck, adjusted his hat with hands trembling slightly, and looked at his own distorted reflection in a piece of window glass. He didn't see there the laughing man from before the fire, nor just the shrunken shadow of recent years, but something between the two, a marked face, deep eyes, but with a new steadiness. Claire, for her part, put on a dress Miss Pearl had given her, used but whole and of a livelier colour, tied her hair in a simple bun, and pinned to her neck a cord with a small saint medal that was her mother's. Enna, Rosa and Elias, excited and nervous, wore their best clothes, worn but clean, proud to go to church like insiders, no longer as shamed squatters. They went all together to the church, walking along the dirt road already slightly darkened, dust rising under their feet. Ben accompanied them, holding under his shabby coat the notepad where he had copied the essential parts of the surveyor's ledger. With each step, he felt the weight of that small volume as if it were a hot stone glued to his chest. Silas was in no condition to go, but before they left, he held Claire's hand with surprising strength, asking her to speak, if she had the chance, not only for her father, but for all those who died without seeing their own name written anywhere. The church was full when they arrived. The smell of candles mixed with the sweat of many people crowded on wooden pews, while Reverend Anselm, in his simple cassock, prepared to start the prayers before the image of St. Bennet. Colonel Horace occupied his usual spot, in a front pew, slightly to the right from where he could see the altar and most of the faithful without needing to turn his head much. His dark suit clashed with the simpler clothing of the majority, and his well-groomed moustache seemed even stiffer that night. Noticing the entrance of Jeremiah and Claire, his eyes narrowed for an instant, but his face remained in a mask of forced serenity. The first part of the service went like any other year. Reverend Anselm read passages from the prayer book, led hymns everyone knew by heart, spoke of faith in hard times, of perseverance in the face of drought, of obedience to God's will. Voices rose and mingled, creating a chorus that repeated year after year, almost seemed automatic. But beneath the surface of the memorized words, the hearts of many people there beat faster, aware or not that something different was about to happen. When the moment arrived where the preacher usually spoke more freely, commenting on community challenges, a pause too long settled between one sentence and another. It was visible that Anselm was fighting an internal battle. On one side, the closeness to the colonel, the favors received, the church's dependence on the ranch for maintenance. On the other, the sleepless nights since he heard in confession Silas's murmurs about stolen lands, planned fire, and a girl named Helen, who died calling for help. Sweat ran down his forehead, not just because of the heat and candles. Perhaps it was in this small hiatus of silence that something inside Reverend Anselm finally leaned to one side. He took a deep breath, looked quickly at the colonel, then at the people, and began to speak in a way that wasn't in any revival booklet. He spoke of sins that weren't just individual weaknesses, but also collective injustices. He said, without citing names, that God saw from above when someone took advantage of a position of power to take what belonged to others. He commented that time might pass, ashes might scatter, but certain things written on paper and engraved in the memory of those who suffered didn't get erased by any fire. These words fell into the tense silence of the church like stones in a calm lake. Some faithful exchanged glances, others lowered their eyes even more. The colonel shifted his body in the chair, jaw clenched, but kept his posture. It was in this atmosphere that Ben, sweating cold, took the step he had been rehearsing. From the pew where he was, he raised his voice with respect, asking the preacher's permission to speak something to the community after the prayer. The preacher hesitated for a second, but perhaps still buoyed by his own recent courage, consented, saying that once the official part was over, anyone needing to share something important could do so. When the last hymn was sung and people began to move, adjusting skirts and hats to leave, Ben's voice rose again, firmer. He asked them not to leave yet, to stay a little longer, because what he had to say concerned not just one family, but many. The colonel, realizing the direction things would take, tried to cut off the movement, standing up and declaring that matters of justice were resolved in the proper place, not in church. But to his surprise, some people were already standing, curious, holding their children by the arm, but not leaving. It was as if the hunger to understand what was happening in the shadows was greater at that hour than the habitual fear. Ben began telling his own story, assuming the guilt that haunted him. He said that years ago he worked as a clerk in the registry and saw with these very eyes deeds being altered, names being swapped, agreements made with few witnesses. He confessed to erasing under orders the names of folks who had a right to the lands and helping write in their place those of someone who already had more than he needed. He spoke of the fire at the scorched orchard, of how the next morning orders arrived to consider certain papers lost forever, even knowing some still existed. His voice trembled at certain points, but no one interrupted him. Next, Ben mentioned, without giving away the hiding place, the existence of the surveyor's ledger. He explained in simple words that there was an old record measuring every piece of that region, saying who had a right to what, and that this record pointed to a division very different from the one everyone knew now. He said that, among the names written there, were those of families who to this day lived as squatters, without ever having a deed in hand, and that of a woman named Helen, married to a saddler everyone there knew. Saying this, he turned his face to Jeremiah, who felt his legs shake but remained standing. It was inevitable that the colonel would try to react. He took a few steps forward, raised his voice, accusing Ben of being a resentful man, fired for incompetence, who now wanted revenge by inventing stories. He said that if there was a notebook, it was old stuff, worthless, that land titles were made in the registry, with stamps, not in scribbles hidden in a burnt house. He tried to end the conversation there, offering again the speech that everything he did was for the good of the region, that without his strong hand there would be disorder, conflict, shed blood. It was then that Jeremiah's voice, for the first time in many years, rose above the buzz, drawing everyone's attention in a way he didn't expect himself. He didn't speak with studied eloquence, but with the strength of someone who finally found words for a pain that was always mute. He recounted, in front of everyone, detail by detail, of the night of the fire. The sudden flash in the barn, men running with buckets that weren't enough, the heat cutting the air, the beam falling on his head, the hands holding him back from going back to get Helen. He didn't accuse with a pointing finger, but asked questions that echoed in the church. Why didn't they let him try? Why did the orders that night seem more concerned with saving certain things than certain people? Why right after did they make a point of saying it was an accident, without any investigation? While he spoke, Claire's hand touched his arm lightly, in a gesture of support that years earlier would have made Jeremiah recoil. But there, in the middle of all those people, the touch was like leaning on solid rock. He didn't back away. On the contrary, he found strength in that contact to continue, this time mentioning, though without showing, that they held a notebook with measurements and names that told another story of those lands. He said he didn't want to take anything from anyone by force, that he didn't seek blind revenge, but that he couldn't stay silent, knowing that the death of Helen and so many others might be part of a plan to erase the rights of entire families. From there, something began to change in people's faces. An old cowboy, hat in hand, took a step forward and confirmed in a hoarse voice that on that night he saw the colonel's men carrying kerosene cans, something he always thought strange, but never had the courage to comment on. A middle-aged woman who had worked as a cook at the ranch said she remembered being ordered, in a hurry, to take boxes out of the office before the fire got there. While other parts of the house were still burning, a young man, son of an old tenant farmer, commented that his father always said before dying that one day they would discover the land where he toiled wasn't stolen, and that this was written somewhere someone tried to hide. Reverend Anselm, seeing the thing grow before him, had to decide which side of history he would stand on. This time, he didn't hesitate as much. He said firmly that the church couldn't close its ears to reports of injustice, that if there were old documents and testimonies, it would be a sin to pretend nothing was happening. He didn't position himself as judge of the matter, but gave the weight of legitimacy to the right of those speaking, preventing the colonel from ordering, right there, everyone to be silenced by force. It was a small gesture in appearance, but gigantic in practice. At this point, it's natural that whoever is listening to this story out there in another corner might have their hearts squeezed, following every held breath and every risky word. If that's your case, if this turnaround, this moment where simple folks find courage to break an ancient silence is touching your heart, you know what to do. This is the time to leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and share this narrative with those you love. Because stories like this remind us that even in the most forgotten corners, there are people fighting so that truth defeats fear, and that can light a light in many lives out there. The news of that confrontation in the church spread through the region faster than any previous rumor. For the colonel, that was a blow to the authority he had grown accustomed to exercising without challenge. The next day, he gathered his men on the porch of Hopewell Ranch, pacing from one side to the other, his face redder than normal. He spoke in a hard tone, accusing Ben, Jeremiah, and Claire of destabilizing the peace of the region, of inciting the ignorant against those who always took care of them. He ordered them to reinforce surveillance around the scorched house, to pay attention to any movement of travel out of the village, to be ready to give a scare to anyone insisting on following that story. But the tide was no longer running in the same direction as before. Part of the henchmen, though still fearing the colonel's power, began to look at the ground when he spoke of taking care of the people, remembering their own families living in stick shacks on other people's land. The seed cast in the church hadn't fallen on hard rock. In many houses at night, while the lantern burned the last of the kerosene, couples whispered about the lands, about the names of grandparents who perhaps should have appeared in that notebook, about the possibility, however remote, of one day not needing to ask permission to plant their own beans. Meanwhile, at the scorched orchard, the mood alternated between fear and a strange sense of relief. Fear, because they knew they had poked a sleeping bear with a short stick, and the reaction could be violent. Relief, because somehow the secret was no longer just theirs. Even if they burned the notebook, even if they tore up the copies, there were already loose words in the air, stories told in church, memories revived in the heads of people who, otherwise, would have died taking everything to the grave. It was as if, suddenly, the weight of silence, which previously fell entirely on Jeremiah and Claire's shoulders, had been distributed across more backs. The most concrete response from the colonel came a few days later, when a messenger from the city arrived, bringing a somewhat improvised summons. It said Jeremiah, Ben, and Claire were to present themselves in the county seat a few weeks from then, to explain before an authority the accusations they were making. In a tone of thinly veiled threat, the paper mentioned possible crimes of slander and defamation against a man of standing. Behind that forced invitation, however, there was an opening Ben was the first to see. That would be the opportunity to take, officially, the copies of the notebook and the testimonies out of the direct reach of the colonel's hands. The trip wouldn't be easy. It would require days on the road, cost of transport, exposure to ambushes. But it was a step that, once taken, could hardly be undone without drawing the attention of people even more powerful than the colonel, in instances above the village. After much thinking, weighing, and praying, they decided to accept. The unlikely trio would go: Jeremiah, the saddler marked by fire; Claire, the young woman carrying the memory of her father's lost land; and Ben, the regretful scribe. They would leave the children under the care of Miss Pearl and a trusted neighbour, and Silas under the watch of village folks who began to see in him not just a sick old man, but an important piece of a larger story. The night before departure was silent and heavy. Jeremiah paced back and forth in the manor, running his hand along the walls as if wanting to memorize every crack, every soot stain. At a certain moment, he stopped before the place where the broken crucifix had fallen, now placed back on the wall, still with the splinter visible. He closed his eyes and, without very complicated words, made a simple prayer. Asked for protection for the journey, asked that, if it were to go wrong, that at least the truth found some crack to escape through. Also asked, in an almost imperceptible whisper, that Helen could somehow be proud of the man he was trying to become. The journey to the county seat was grueling, made by ox cart and, in certain stretches, on foot, along roads that seemed never to end. The heat of the day and the cold of the night alternated in a game that punished body and mind. On the way, they crossed with cattle drives, solitary travellers, small groups going in the opposite direction. Every time they stopped at a roadside post, Ben took care to guard well the bag with the notepad and some original pages of the ledger, wrapped in sturdy cloth, always within reach. Jeremiah and Claire, for their part, kept a watchful eye around, too accustomed to the ways violence could disguise itself as carelessness. Arriving in the city, they were received with the bureaucratic coldness of those used to seeing simple folks entering official doors with eyes down. The building where they would be heard was large, with high walls, glass windows, and a stone staircase that echoed the steps of those ascending. Inside, a man in an ill-fitting suit, with glasses on the tip of his nose, received them as if he had more haste than attention. But seeing the papers Ben pulled from the bag, with old letters, surveyor scribbles, and signatures of dead people, the official's gaze gained a bit more focus. He ordered them to wait in an antechamber and went to call someone of higher rank. The deposition that followed would take hours. Each one would have to tell their part, repeat details, endure suspicious questions, revisit the night of the fire, speak of the hiding place in the floor, of the box of buried coins, of the veiled and explicit threats. It wouldn't be a quick victory, much less guaranteed. But the simple fact of seeing those ancient leaves, now resting on a wooden table before someone who owed nothing to Colonel Horace, was, in itself, a rupture with the closed circle of fear in which they had lived so long. While this front opened in the city, in St. Benet's Crossing things also moved. The absence of Jeremiah, Claire, and Ben didn't go unnoticed. Some said they had fled with their tails between their legs, beaten by the weight of the Colonel's name. Others, better informed, murmured they had gone up north or to the big city to face paper justice with paper in hand. The children, under Miss Pearl's care, missed the adults, but found comfort in the affectionate way many people now treated them. They were no longer seen just as nephews of a sick man and charges of an uppity girl, but as part of a family that was, somehow, representing everyone. The Colonel, realizing things had escaped his direct control, began to withdraw, in a way only those who knew him well could notice. He spoke less in public, avoided certain conversations at the store, limited himself to circulating more within the limits of his own ranch. It wasn't repentance, but calculation. He knew that if he reacted with explicit violence after Jeremiah and the others went to the city, he would call upon himself a light he always knew how to manipulate away. At the same time, his figure no longer caused the same automatic silence when entering places. Some conversations even stopped, but when he left, they restarted in a different tone, less fearful, more indignant. The legal outcome of that story didn't arrive overnight, nor with a spectacular sentence. What came, over the following months, was a dragging of processes, comings and goings of papers, demands for new proofs, extra depositions. At a certain point, a small committee of village people was called to testify, and gradually, a reasonably clear picture of what happened began to form in the eyes of the law. It was established in documents that there were irregularities in the region's land records, that the division made years ago contradicted agreements signed with some families, that the concentration of power in the hand of a single house had no basis only in the strength of work, but also in administrative tricks. The practical consequence of this was the reopening of old possession processes. A part of the lands of Hopewell Ranch was, by order of outsiders, broken up and destined for small nuclei of farmers. It wasn't everything, nor was it perfect, but it was enough for families like Claire's and others who recognized themselves in the notebook lines to finally receive a piece of ground with a deed in hand. The colonel, pressured on one side and still surrounded by privileges on the other, decided to sell part of what remained to him and, little by little, withdrew from the front line of the region, leaving in his place heirs less feared, more worried about saving what they could of the old prestige. For Jeremiah and Claire, the moral decision about what to do with what they had helped unleash materialized in a gesture many in the village commented on for years. They accepted, yes, the piece of land that was theirs, close to what had once been the backyard of the scorched orchard. They built a simple house there, with whitewashed adobe walls, a new roof, and a small porch from where one could see, in the back, the old burnt tree which, over time, came to share space with new saplings planted by Anna Rosa and Elias. But they refused proposals of extra advantages. Some tried to offer them in exchange for forgetting the rest. Instead of accumulating more than they needed, they made a point of supporting other families in the fight for similar pieces of ground. Jeremiah's transformation was visible even to those who didn't pay much attention. The man who previously walked the streets with his head down now greeted with his chin up, looking in the eye. The paralyzing fear of touching any woman dissolved into gestures of naturalness and respect. At simpler parties, when a fiddle player appeared, sometimes he was seen, shyly at first, then with more ease, accepting to spin a slow waltz with Claire or even with other women of the village, without that meaning betrayal to the past. Touch, which one day represented for him the border of trauma, had also become a channel to demonstrate care, friendship, affection. Claire, for her part, stopped being just the girl who arrived from afar with a paper in a saddle. She became a reference for other women who, like her, carried stories of loss and expropriation. She began helping organize small meetings at the church and the store, explaining, with the teaching she learned from Ben, what the stamps on the papers meant, how certain mechanisms of power worked, how no one should sign anything without understanding. Her pain transformed into strength, not only for her own family, but for a larger portion of the community. The impact on the village, as years passed, could be seen in both big and small things. Where before there was only pasture of a single owner, diverse homesteads sprang up, with rows of corn, beans, cassava, squash. The part of the scorched house that still stood was partially restored with collective effort. They fixed part of the roof, reinforced walls, cleaned the yard. Not to erase the past, but to give it another use. Some suggested transforming the manor into a kind of primary school, where children could learn to read and write without needing to walk leagues to another locality. Reverend Anselm and Ben got involved in this, bringing old books, improvising desks, teaching right there, under the attentive gaze of walls that had seen so much forced silence. The old burnt tree, which for so long was seen as a symbol of a curse, gained over the years a new function. Its few living branches began to be cared for by Ana Rosa, who insisted on cleaning them, fertilizing the ground, tying colorful ribbons on the strongest limbs. With every fruit that appeared, crooked but yellow and fragrant, she smiled as if seeing a domestic miracle. Around it, new saplings grew, forming a small orchard. Folks who previously made the sign of the cross when passing there began to stop to pick a fruit, make lemonade on hot days, or home remedy for coughs on cold days. It was as if, in a slow and discreet way, the place that once summarized fire, loss, and fear began to tell a story of new beginnings too. Years later, when someone new arrived in St. Benet's Crossing and asked about the widower of the fire, they no longer received the same answer as before. They didn't speak anymore of a man who wouldn't touch any woman, but of someone who had the courage to, even full of scars, face those who seemed unreachable. When they asked about the girl who one day arrived mounted on a tired mule with an old saddle in her lap, they said she was the one who brought, hidden in a piece of burnt leather, the thread that pulled an entire web of buried truths. On any given afternoon, many years after all this, Jeremiah sat on the porch of the new house, with the sun starting to lower, and a milder wind passing between the leaves of the lemon trees. His hands, still marked by leather calluses, rested on his legs without the old tremor. From inside, Claire's voice was heard talking to someone about a meeting at the church, the laughter of Ana Rosa and Elias arguing whether or not to go swim in the creek before supper. The smell of fresh coffee came from the kitchen, mixed with wet earth from a recent rain, and the citrus perfume of ripe fruit on the tree. He closed his eyes for an instant and let memory bring him, no longer just the image of the fire, but also everything that came after. The old saddle, the paper with Helen's name and his, the surveyor's ledger, the night in the church, the trip to the city, the first plantings in the new fields. He realized that however much the past continued to be part of him, it was no longer the only thing defining him. There was also the living present in that house, on that land, in those people, and in a thought that came more like an intimate conversation than a rehearsed conclusion, he realized that after so many years avoiding any contact, he had learned again to touch and be touched, not only on the skin but in the heart. The story of St. Benet's Crossing moved forward, with other struggles, other droughts, other small victories. But among the many narratives the people told on the porch, around the wood stove, or on the side of the road, one always returned, that of a man who passed years living as a shadow, afraid to touch any woman, until a young stranger arrived with an unexpected request, bringing to light inside a burnt saddle a piece of truth the hinterland had tried to hide. And it was from that request, from that unlikely meeting, that he found courage to face what he feared most, transform pain into justice, and leave, for those who came after, a trail of hope planted in the middle of the dry earth.